I'm Director Bishotsky. I just wanted to mention I need to leave early to be in a press conference with Mexico on the 24-month study. So largely today, I'll be here for 45 minutes or so. And because of that, I'm going to hand this microphone over to Carol, who's going to run the meeting.
Okay, thank you, Director Bishotsky. Good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. The day's flying past. So welcome to the second Assured Water Supply Committee meeting. Thank you all for taking the time to attend today's meeting. For the sake of those who are listening online as well as procedure, I'm going to ask Council Coordinator Trent Blumberg to please call the roll. Please be prepared to unmute yourself and indicate that you are present.
All right, I'll run through. If you are online, please speak up, or if you're an alternate for someone, also let us know. All right, Brenda Berman.
Patrick Dent, alternate for Brenda Berman.
Cynthia Campbell. Doug Dunham.
Rusty Bowers, alternate for Doug.
Kathy Ferris. Representative Gail Griffin.
Present.
Spencer Camps.
Present.
John Kamik.
Present.
Leslie Myers.
It's you.
That's me. I'm filling in for Leslie, the Krista McJunkin. Thank you.
Joe Olson.
Present.
Clark Princell.
Present.
Robin Sahid.
Present.
Okay. Joe Singleton.
Present.
Senator Priya Sundaresan.
Present.
Warren Tenney.
Present.
And Sandra Watson.
Ken Burns for Sandra Watson.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trent. All right, also joining us today at the table from the DWR staff, we have Ben Alternator, Chief Legislative Liaison, Nicole Klobas, our Chief Counsel, and Natalie Mast, AMA Director. I think I caught everybody. So we will get right into the agenda. Once we overcome our IT challenges. Thank you for your patience. All right, there we go. So this is our agenda for today. I'll touch on the objective for this meeting, provide a committee update. We'll have discussion of several proposal concepts that have been raised, and we'll wrap up with next steps and closing remarks. Slide. Okay, and first I want to just provide a reminder that the objective of the Assured Water Supply Committee is to review and make recommendations for updates to assured water supply policies legislatively, administratively, or by executive action to address the challenges revealed by the modeling projections. Our deliverables are policy recommendations that meet the objective and the principles, and our focus is development of high priority, well-constructed proposals, keeping our tight timeline in mind, of course. Next slide. And just once again, our principles are that proposals must protect the strength and integrity of the Assured Water Supply Program. Proposals should enable future growth without reliance on mined groundwater. Proposals may not reduce the 100-year requirement or increase the depth to which groundwater may be pumped. Proposals must ensure that there is water before growth, and proposals must also protect consumers. Next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly recap our progress to date in this committee. We held the first meeting of the Assured Water Supply Committee on June 27th. The issue that we need to address was described, as well as the committee's task, objective, principles, and process. ADWR staff presented several proposal concepts for consideration. ideas for addressing wildcat and build-to-rent development, commingling challenges, and future infrastructure challenges. Committee members offered proposed concepts at the meeting and submitted additional concepts to staff in follow-up to that meeting. A compilation of the concepts was subsequently posted on the ADWR website. So the July 13th Assured Water Supply Subcommittee meeting was a working meeting based on the momentum and interests expressed by members at the first committee meeting and in prior forums. The committee began exploring initial concepts. These included concepts to address the issues of commingling and future infrastructure. After discussion, addressing these two issues independently was put on hold in favor of exploring the concept of an alternative hybrid path to designation, which would include addressing commingling and future infrastructure. The hybrid designation concept was described broadly, and it was discussed at some length. Doug Dunham offered to work with interested subcommittee members to begin building that concept into a preliminary proposal to then bring back to the subcommittee for consideration and discussion, and that effort is underway. A second alternative designation concept, referred to as a nested designation, was discussed as a means to address the commingling issue in certain specific instances. Given the narrow applicability of the proposed solution and the potential to otherwise address commingling through other proposed concepts, that was set aside for the time being. The potential to incentivize development on ag land was discussed. No one immediately volunteered to flesh out that idea further, but it is certainly open for discussion at future meetings. Interest in exploring the potential for retiring grandfathered rights was expressed, and this is going to be one of our topics of discussion today. So our objective today is to continue the discussion of the proposed concepts that I have highlighted here on this slide, building off the momentum and comments received at prior meetings. We will explore how build-to-rent developments could be brought under the Assured Water Supply Program and the issues involved in wildcat development. If time allows, we will, as I said, hopefully begin discussing the concept of retiring grandfathered rights. Next slide, please. Thank you. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Ben Altenator, ADWR's Chief Legislative Liaison, to describe the issue of build-to-rent development and the concept proposed to address it. Ben, if you'd take it from here, thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, committee. So you'll recall that these two items were noted in our last meeting and the challenges identified. And again, just as a recap, those challenges were because the BTR communities don't meet the definition of a subdivision, they're not subject to the Assured Water Supply requirements, program requirements, and Wildcat and build-to-rent developments do not have the consumer protections of an Assured Water Supply program. And then continued development without an Assured Water Supply exacerbates groundwater mining, puts homeowners at risk, and feeds negative perceptions of Arizona's ability to manage our water supply. So we've come back with a couple concepts for the committee to consider on these items. Next slide. So just so we're all on the same page and we're not conflating these two items, I've made a best attempt here to come up with a definition on this vernacular. So the build-to-rent communities are residential developments that do not meet the definition of a subdivision. And these communities are single-family rentals, but fall under the exemption from subdivisions that they're leased for less than 1 year, or they're not subdivided into more than 5 lots. In all other aspects, though, they look and smell and taste just like any other residential subdivision, including common areas and external water demands. And I think it's important to note also that the market has been what's driven this unique demand for this type of community. And it's simply another option for renters who don't want to live in traditional multifamily housing without the commitment of home buying. The informal term wildcat is the proliferation of development by subdividing new residential parcels of 6 or more lots with the intent to circumvent laws relating to the creation of a subdivision. And of course, that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people depending on who you ask. A wildcat is also confusingly applied to legal lot splitting of a parcel up to 5 lots, up to 5 times. The real issue, though, with wildcat development is those who are intentionally trying to avoid subdivision laws by acting in concert or otherwise obfuscating their true intent. Next slide. So with respect to the build-to-rent concept, again, the goal is to ensure that BTR communities are under the protection of the Assured Water Supply Program, and there's parity between the subdivision across the street and the BTR community. So many of these suggested provisions to address build-to-rent were taken from discussions and language surrounding build-to-rent legislation this past legislative session. A lot of progress was made on trying to define these communities and address stakeholder concerns. So the proposal you'll see before you encompasses 3 key tenets in order to find a solution to the goal. The first is defining these communities, and we use the artful term of residential lease community. The proposal defines a residential lease community to differentiate these leased residential single-family units from other multifamily commercial rent options, and addresses the number of single-family housing units and specifies that the number of these units per lot or parcel is not a consideration. Next slide. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, sorry. And the current statute also provides an exemption for homes for lease under 1 year. And so under this concept, we would clarify that residential lease communities are essential single-family homes offered for lease without regard to how long the lease term is. And then lastly, under Title 45 in the Assured Water Supply Program, these residential lease communities would be viewed the same way as a subdivision. So like I mentioned before, including external water use, common areas, et cetera. Next slide. The second portion of the build-to-rent concept would ensure that all applicable fees are paid to CAGRID if there are replenishment obligations, just as a subdivision would. And then the third item would provide for enforcement, so that if a residential lease community is not part of a subdivision or a designated water provider, or has not obtained a certificate, the city or county would not approve a building permit. Before I turn it over to the committee for comments on the concept, I did want to highlight and thank those who worked over the past legislative session on this issue, including a lot of folks on this committee, Senator Sundaration, Home Builders and Spencer, one of the bill sponsors, Representative Griffin, and I believe Stuart Goodman is here as well. He represents the National Rental Home Council. Stuart, is there anything you might want to add, be helpful on this issue to the committee?
Good afternoon, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Stuart Goodman, here on behalf of the National Rental Home Council. Members, if I can start, if you go back to the legislative session, we were originally retained by the council to focus on parity issues between single-family owner-occupied and the build-to-rent or single-family tenant-occupied. Our focus had been that a single-family dwelling unit is a single-family dwelling unit, regardless of whether it is rented or owned. It's true whether it's the design side, the zoning side, you could name the host of elements in regard to that with regard to how one builds a residence. As part of that conversation, the issue obviously expanded into the issue of the certificate. Mr. Chairman, members, we supported Ms. Griffin's bill out of the notion that we can't cherry pick, right? You can't say we're parity on zoning, but we're going to take advantage of a loophole. That didn't seem right to us. And so from our standpoint, we support the bill, and today we still support that bill. But the broader picture for us, the broader picture is the notion of parity. And so I respect that there's a conversation about BTR and what is the motivation behind those communities. Lots of discussion about, well, you just want BTR for the advantage of the exemption. Doing this for 33 years now. I know that individual companies have their own motivations, but I also know as an industry, broadly at the 18,000 foot level, the focus is the market. And there is a market for those individuals that don't want multifamily. I don't mean that in a disparaging way, right? It's a choice, and people have preferences. And these are individuals that can't afford home ownership either because of the down payment, they don't want the burden of the monthly maintenance that requires, or for a host of other reasons. But they don't want to live in a multifamily complex. And so a single family unit makes the most sense for them. That's the motivation broadly for the industry. And so as we look at this issue and this proposal, again, look, we remain supportive because we supported the bill last year. We also know that there'll be ongoing discussions in this committee and elsewhere. And my main message is to, one, keep BTR at the table, and I appreciate being invited to speak today, but also sticking to our broad roots, which is that build to rent should be treated the same as single family. And whatever iteration that evolves, whether it's this or some derivative, whatnot, we want to be consistent in those objectives. With that, I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you, Stuart. We can turn to the council now if there's any comments or questions on the concept or for Stuart.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Ben. I actually had a question on the wording of number 3. Because if I'm following the concept of what you're trying to do, it seems like we might be missing some language right at the end. It says basically that the plating authority won't approve it unless you have a certificate or a written commitment of service from a municipality or private water company. Does it mean a written commitment of service from a designated provider?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Spencer?
You know, the fact of the matter is that, you know, Arizona right now in our economy is suffering from the current water situation and the release of the model. You know, investment is down. Land prices are increasing in designated providers. Land prices outside designated providers are decreasing. Existing housing projects outside designated providers are stalled. And you couple that situation with our housing supply shortage. You know, the Department of Housing has done a study recognizing that we're 270,000 units short. The situation we are in, good or bad, has exacerbated that problem. It has not helped that. And whether we like it or not, our economy is now intertwined with water. And everybody on this council is very astute and smart as it relates to water, but not necessarily when it comes to the economy. And I hope I'm not, but I think I'm the only person on this council that actually cares about housing affordability and policy. And that's important to my industry. And I think prior to us shutting down a housing product that is a viable housing product for many people out there, like you have done to my industry, quite honestly, we ought to think of solutions that we need to make for sale housing an option for consumers. I think we're a little bit ahead of the horse here. I think we need to think about housing options for people. This administration has put together a homeless council to look specifically at shelters for people in critical need. Apartments and rental units are a part of that matrix that we need to think about. Specifically, you need to think about the housing ladder of how people move up through the housing chain to achieve ownership. And rentals are a key piece of that step. Under this proposal, what we ultimately would do is say in Buckeye and Queen Creek and Maricopa County, this housing product is no longer going to exist in addition to for sale housing. That's not a good economic outcome, no matter how you shake at it. So I recommend we take a pause on this until we find solutions to put for sale housing into options for buyers outside designated providers. That's my recommendation.
Spencer, I appreciate your comments on that. But this is definitely a proposal, a concept that has received much discussion to date. And I think it would behoove us all to have some further discussion around this one. I don't think we're shutting anything out at this time. We're going to be looking at other concepts for moving things forward. Stuart, do you have anything that you would say in response, or does anybody else have any questions? Yes, Mr. Bowers.
Thank you. I would like to just ask, if these are to rent, what if they were to sell? Can the same product be purchased at a reduced rate as a less constricted or confined by spacing and square footage by lot? Are any of those available, Stuart, that you know of? Or has that been discussed previously by the committee?
Speaker Bowers, my understanding, each company has their own model. There are some companies within the industry that do sort of have what I would call a transitional program from renting the unit to ultimately purchasing the unit. But that is a company by company decision, and it's not a universal approach. So they do offer those programs, but it's not necessarily for every company or every particular renter who transitions to home ownership.
And then the follow-up would be, why couldn't you still have that community that we saw the plat of representing and have it receive an assured water supply certificate? Why does renting void the need of having an AWS certificate?
I don't think that question's for me.
Yes, Spencer, you were next.
It's a choice by the applicant on zoning. So think of a subdivider has to subdivide the property because they're transferring it. And so when you seek zoning, you break every parcel into lots to do that. So that's part of the zoning process. A BTR or a typical multifamily project is a commercial plan. You're not separating that project into specific lots, hence the subdivision definition, the 6 lots or more. You're just one large commercial plan. You actually go through separate zoning because you're not a residential subdivision, you're not a subdivider, so you go through different zoning, and therefore you don't need a certificate of assured water supply. So it's a decision essentially by the applicant.
So the decision is by the applicant, but not by the possible purchaser or renter. The person who's trying to get a job at the semi plant, you could probably rent a house, but you could probably buy a house for less than the rent price. All things considered, it's usually less. And so if that's something that we could address in statute or in even by policy, but better in statute, that you could offer an option in the zoning arena to allow of high density, better single family units, why couldn't that work?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Spencer.
To sell, you need you need a public report under state law. And to get a public report, you need a certificate of assured water supply.
Right?
So you gotta go through the assured water supply program if you want to sell.
So to all, so the question again really isn't about the buyer or the owner or the occupier. The one that housing is designed for. It's about the applicant trying to find a way to present a product maybe a little cheaper and maybe with a little more flexibility as to location, but can avoid some of the zoning requirements that would otherwise be imposed on a commercial operation. Okay.
Okay, I saw Senator Sundaration had her hand up.
Yes, thank you. I want to comment on the overall proposal and generally just say thank you to all of you for reviving the bill that Representative Griffin had previously put together. And I think that this would be, something that I hope we can continue to work on next session. And also, thank you to the National Rental Home Council for seeking parity, because I do think this comes down to the ultimate consumer protection principle that we're trying to keep here with assured water supply. I mean, I just recently spoke to some of my constituents who, it turns out they're not actually in Tucson water territory. So there are there are areas where, even within my district, they had lower, cheaper purchase costs for their homes. And then, some 10, 20 years later are learning that their water infrastructure is declining and now face a later cost because they're not protected by the designated water provider. And that's simply, for their infrastructure costs. I mean, we're not even necessarily talking about the cost of the physical provision of the water. So I definitely do think that the emphasis on parity here is really important. I would like to go further and even into the future concepts on the Wildcat as well, just reducing entirely the number of people who are able to purchase a home without that assurance of water supply. But I recognize that, the concepts here are, especially this build to rent one, is one that has been negotiated and discussed amongst a number of parties. So I really, congratulate and kudos to the folks who are here and on board. And as to the broader housing discussion, I think that's absolutely something that many of us do care about, but I don't think that sacrificing the consumer protection in the short term to ultimately leave people without an assured water supply is going to be a long-term fix to that. And I do think there are other conversations to be had on housing broadly.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any other comments? Representative Griffin, please.
Yes, thank you. I think the fairness issue is the fee. Whether or not there's a certificate is another issue. The seller's disclosure form, the property information report, is given to a buyer. And if these aren't for sale, there's no reason to have the seller's disclosure property report. The seller's disclosure forms for sale, I do have the next issue that we'll discuss. I'll jump in on that one too. But the fee, I think a build-to-rent development looks just like the subdivision, and the subdivision's paying the fee and the build-to-rent is not. That's the fairness issue. I think the fee needs to be paid by both. But, if we don't do something and agree, there's going to be 20,000 new homes for rent. And we should be talking about, in the next subject, is the American dream, being able to afford that home. And the build to rent, I understand many of them have 10-year restrictions on them, so that maybe at the end of 10 years, they would be available to purchase at that time. a certificate and a public report would be required, so it would protect the public. But I do have a bill file opened.
Thank you, Representative Griffin. Yes, Spencer.
I just want to touch on what a point. It's on the consumer protection side of things, because it's my understanding, and I'm certainly welcome to be educated on this because I wasn't in the room when this happened, but the 100-year requirement was a consumer protection requirement for good reason, as it relates to somebody making one of the largest investments of their life, which is the purchase of a home. And when we try and put that standard on the rental community, I understand the desire to secure water supplies for the rental community, but there really is no consumer protection component that I see. And again, I'm more than willing to be educated on it. You're essentially protecting the property owner's investment, because if a renter were unable to access water, if water didn't come out of the tap, you can simply cancel your lease. Now, that's not a fortunate circumstance, obviously, but they're not harmed in the sense that they're not going to be financially out of an investment such as a home ownership. So if protecting consumers is always a noble goal, but as it relates to the assured water supply program and the intent behind protecting for sale housing as it relates to the 100 years for consumer protection, I don't know if that same standard would apply in a rental community.
Stuart, and then we'll get to you, Warren. Thank you.
Real quickly, members, I should have mentioned this, again, focusing on parity, but also Mrs. Griffin mentioned fairness. One of the other aspects of her original bill that I would like to make sure we have the discussion is the idea of you have developments, investments that are currently underway. We would want to make sure that those investments are protected, sort of a grandfather clause approach, if you will, to recognize that folks have made investments under the current law. When you change that law, whether it's this concept or some other concept for that matter, having a recognition of folks following the law at the time in which they made their investment is an important component. I know we've had conversations with the governor's office about that concept as well. And again, no specific details to be fair, but I think a general appreciation, no commitment, but an appreciation for the concern. Again, whether it's this approach or some derivative down the road. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Warren?
I have a couple of questions just to try to better understand this topic. One is, if after 10 years they are able to sell, and then at that time they have to get the assured water supply designation, I'm just trying to figure out how that works considering everything that we're dealing with right now. And then also I'm wondering how that works for the GRD. Do you have to catch up for the 10 years? How does the GRD plan for that? And so those were two questions that I have on how this works.
Cynthia, yes.
The other thing I would mention is I respectfully disagree with Spencer on this issue in the sense of consumer protection in the context of building in an unincorporated or a non-designated area. This is an aquifer is a thing. It's not split up by parcel. And so if you've got a number of users who are pumping the aquifer without regard to how much they're using, whether there's enough for them, that does have an impact on people around who did buy houses, who did live up to the assured water supply, and their assured water supply is threatened. So it is a consumer protection device if we allow loopholes like this that proliferate groundwater pumping without accounting for it in the models, without accounting for it as supplies that are actually there. And that goes for whether it's build to rent or frankly, commercial and industrial development that is allowed to pump without a designation.
Let me get to Ben and then Spencer, I'll come back.
I didn't know if Patrick or Laura, if you wanted to chime in on the CRGRD question that Warren had.
I'm happy to. I think Warren might acknowledge a particular planning issue that we would have to think about, but the GRD would, of course, only provide replenishment once that old property acquired a certificate in association with the Assured Water Supply Program and started reporting its demands. But I think we would presume if there was excess groundwater that was required to be replenished by that now owned home, we would have that obligation.
But then getting back to the point Cynthia just made is there's 10 years, for hypothetically 10 years, there's 10 years that have gone by without any replenishment occurring. So then does the GRD have to catch that up, or are you just starting from that 10-year period? And
Yes, Patrick.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question. I certainly think that we would be on the hook for once it was owned in the consumer protection, but whether or not that the back payment of the pumping of the aquifer when that was a rental would still be a matter of policy to be determined.
So that sounds like a point of further discussion for this concept. Thank
Laura
you.
says no. I said maybe.
Thank you. And Spencer, you had another comment, I believe.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Cynthia's comments. I agree with you, actually, but the only difference is aquifer management is a really good goal. And if we want to take land uses to put into the Assured Water Supply program to achieve that, that's fine. But that's aquifer management. It's not consumer protection. There are no consumers when it comes to rentals. All right, it's the landowner's investment that you're protecting. And we can decide that that's a goal we want to pursue. I'm not knocking that. I'm just saying that aquifer management and consumer protection, at least when the Groundwater Management Act was created, according to my understanding, are two different goals, both good, but two different goals.
Did you want to? I'm sorry, Nicole, go ahead.
I thought I'd clarify that the Assured Water Supply statute does appear in the management section of the groundwater code, and it is intended to be both a groundwater management program and a consumer protection program. Originally, the Adequate Water Supply program was developed as solely a consumer protection program. And when the groundwater code was developed, the Assured Water Supply program took the Adequate Water Supply program as its beginning and then added water management components, including requirements that any groundwater use be consistent with the management goal and the management plan of the AMA. So it is both a consumer protection and a groundwater management program. As to the GRD question, under current statute, the replenishment obligations would only begin to accrue once the land is enrolled. There is no back payment of replenishment obligation.
Okay, do we have any additional specific feedback on this concept and the way that it has been proposed? Yes, Mr. Bowers.
We are under the understanding that with what Ms. Griffin said, that there will be obviously more discussion as this concept is revived from last year's work and moves forward.
Certainly.
I just wanted to remind us that groundwater pumping needs to be reduced as a goal, and that our consistency should be towards that. And to remind us that Pueblo Grande is an example of high density housing in the absence of an AWS program.
Representative
Blue one
Griffin.
right down the street.
Okay, thank you.
I think the fee go towards replenishment would take care of that one issue.
Carol, I have some feedback.
Yes.
I was just gonna, my last comment, I think, is on the language here under number 3. I'm not also familiar with the, the where BTRs are widespread. But wondering if limiting it to just the initial AMAs makes sense, or if we should include any future AMAs as well to head off, the proliferation of unreplenished groundwater use in this manner elsewhere.
Okay, thank you for that comment. And Patrick?
Thank you. I just want to echo some of Nicole's comments that, the example we heard earlier that, the tap might go dry after some decades on hundreds of homes. That's not an outcome that this council and this committee should be okay with, right? We need to be finding solutions that are good for water management. And to have a proliferation of hundreds of homes on one lot that are mining groundwater, they don't have assured water, that's a water management problem that we need to be finding a solution to. And I think the department, in coordination with our legislative leaders here, has laid out a good pathway for that. And I think we need to continue those discussions. Yes, we are working through proposals and solutions to find paths forward for continued sustainable development. And this is an important part of that conversation and these ideas that close loopholes and lead to good water management outcomes. I think we've got some good questions about CAGRD's role in replenishment, but I think one of the benefits of this proposal, as Ben has outlined, is that when you get the assured water supply up front, there is no question about a decade or more of unreplenished pumping. There is no question about how do you get a certificate if you want to sell these homes later when they're all on a single lot. And so that element of this proposal, having the certificate or being served by a designated provider up front, I think is an important one, particularly in avoiding any decoupling of the CAGRD with the Assured Water Supply Program.
Thank you, Patrick. All right, in the interest of time and getting on to some of these other concepts, I think we'll wrap up our discussion of build to rent right now. And Ben, if you want to introduce the next portion of this concept on Wildcat.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, committee, for your feedback. The Wildcat subdivision issue is a somewhat wonky one, and so I think some additional context for the council would be helpful. So we've asked the Department of Real Estate to help unwrap the issue for the committee. So Jim, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Committee, thank you for having Department of Real Estate. My name is Jim Nupp. I serve as the Deputy Commissioner. Also have in the audience Assistant Commissioner Marley McCormick. Appreciate her coming. Her group is actually in charge of the public report reviews and approvals that we'll be talking about. So within the Department of Real Estate, we have 92,000 licensees, salespeople, brokers. Also within the Department of Real Estate, we have what we're going to talk about today. If you want to go to the next slide, it is the subdivision public report. And as we've been talking about, it is to the Department of Real Estate, it is a consumer protection. When a subdivision is created by the county, and the lots are split into 6 or more, statute requires that a public report be submitted and approved prior to the offering of sale or lease of any structures on those lots. Public report, again, is a disclosure tool. There are 25 required items on the public report that the Department of Real Estate reviews. One of those items is a statement related to the provision of water for that lot. On the right side of the screen, you'll see in an AMA, there are 2 ways to meet that water requirement. One is a certificate of assured water be submitted with the public report application, and otherwise a written commitment from a designated provider. Hopefully I'm not telling the committee much new, but really wanted to cover the basics. Next slide. So what we look at is very much if the statute requires it, we require it, and you can't sell or lease without meeting our requirements. So it is very much an if this, then that. In an AMA, to sell or lease lots in a subdivision, an assured water supply is required. Outside of a subdivision, therefore, no assured water is required. Next slide. Over the next 5 slides or so, we're going to be talking about challenges. You can read that as challenges or opportunities. I'll be talking some historical perspective of policy challenges that legislators as well as this committee will be undertaking to come up with concepts. Some of them are current challenges the Department of Real Estate faces today in enforcing current statute. So I'll go back and forth, but I'll try to point out which are current and which are historical. Next slide. So over the, what I'll be covering is acting in concert, the current threshold being 6 or more lots, the timing of the violation being before offering or sale, of offering for sale, and then the idea of contiguous as it relates to a common promotional plan and acting in concert. Next slide. First challenge, and if you were paying attention to the legislative session this last year, acting in concert was certainly a conversation that was being had. Back in 97, the department brought a case against a respondent, a pair of respondents in the Prescott area who had subdivided illegally about 40 lots. In that case, the department, as well as an appellate judge, found that the department merely need to prove ownership to prove acting in concert existed. Owners engaged in the act of commonly agreeing to buy properties, to subdivide, to sell the lots. That very same year that it was in appellate court, legislature introduced and passed legislation that required the department now prove intent as it relates to acting in concert. Proving intent as it relates to acting in concert proves to be a very hard, if not impossible, measure to meet as it relates to Superior Court. Of course, our cases go to the Office of Administrative Hearings, but we should not submit anything to the Office of Administrative Hearings that we should not be able to back up at Superior Court, because that is the first place of appeal for a case. Okay, so 1, we have to prove intent. Otherwise, number 2, acting in concert is very vague, and it depends on a lot of circumstantial evidence that just simply does not exist in a case typically. What we would be looking for, golden rule, is committee member Griffin, I am looking to buy these lots, split them more than 6, and sell them with you to make a profit. That would be perfect in an email. That never happens. So what we have to take is some sort of conglomeration of, again, circumstantial evidence to a judge to attempt to prove that there was intentional acting in concert. That, again, may seem simple. I grew up in Ohio. We lived in a floodplain. My parents and neighbors coordinated to hire a backhoe to share among the yards, the 4 yards, to dig out a ditch to put in a drainage area. Is that acting in concert, or is that neighbors being neighbors? It's an exact example from Rio Verde where there was a backhoe on one property one night, another property the next night. It's simply not enough for us to say that that is acting in concert. So for us to put a case together to take it for acting in concert, we have actually been successful in one instance since 1998, and we did not take it to trial. The parties agreed outside of, during a accelerated settlement agreement, to settle the case outside. We have not taken an acting in concert to court since 1998 and won. Next case, or next slide, please. Next slide, please. Jennifer, we need an assist. Okay, so the current threshold, as you've heard throughout this meeting and likely before, the current statutory requirement is that 6 or more lots requires a subdivision public report. That has not always been the case. In 1937, when subdivision laws first passed in the state of Arizona, it was 4. Most recently, it increased. You'll see multiple 1994s. I'm glad I did not cover the legislature during that year. There were 7 special sessions in 1994. So it's not an error. Those lots went from 6 to, I know you were. Mr. Bowers was lucky enough to sit in the legislature at that time. 95 is the last time that it passed, and it passed with an amendment to change it to 6. Simply to say, 6 is not always the golden rule. It's just where we are today. I know I saw legislation last year that actually would have amended it to one lot requires an assured water supply. I'm not here to suggest policy changes. I'm just telling you the historical perspective and where we are. Next slide. Okay, so the next challenge, and this is a current challenge in the Department of Real Estate. The statute actually makes the violation before the sale or lease. So there is a lot that happens to go in, a lot goes into subdividing land prior to the sale or lease of land. There will be private and municipal or county level surveys performed. There's a preliminary plat that has to be recorded. Each item that I'm covering, I can tell you, costs hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. There's a final plat. There are building permits, and then finally, there is offering for sale or lease. Often a developer will preemptively or be able to sell lots prior to the finished product by getting architectural drawings and selling the idea of what will be built. And prior to that, they do have to get the public report. But I'm just trying to say that there is a lot of money invested in those lots prior to the actual need to obtain a public report. With that, there's not actually a violation until the lots are offered for sale or lease. There is a lot of touching of government entities prior to getting to the point of ADRE jurisdiction. And this is county jurisdiction too. County as well as Department of Real Estate have equal authority to investigate evasions of subdivision laws. Often counties will defer to the state to investigate those. But there are certainly opportunities prior to getting to the state, prior to getting to the readiness of selling or leasing lots that notice of a subdivision being created for sale or lease could occur, and a assured water supply could be received. Next slide, please. Finally, and back to acting in concert, my favorite. We have inside of acting in concert the idea of contiguous. So within if you look at this actual map, you'll see lots 1 through 5. Below that, you'll see 8 through 11. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see 12 through 14. If those streets that are intersecting those properties are maintained by a government entity, we would not count those by default just by ownership of them being a subdivision. They would have to have a common promotional plan for us to say that they are creating a subdivision. So you can see it's 5, 4, and 3. By definition of acting in concert, yes, contiguous knocks this out because it's a street intersecting those lots. And if it were maintained by a municipality, we would not be able to consider them a subdivision without also applying common promotional plan. And that has its own challenges of vagueness. Those are the points I was hoping to bring up with the committee this morning or this afternoon. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Bowers.
What would be our interest as a committee? In subdivision, or would it be in the water? So generally, DWR and or DEQ would have something to do if there was any in concert water provision neighbor to neighbor. And we would have, if they all went with exempt wells, each well, 50,400 gallons a day is legal to be exempt. That's really our point, is the water part. And either with DEQ with quality, but us with quantity. And so I think that the administration, Mr. Adams, is the emphasis more regulated towards what happens with the water?
Thank you, Rusty. If we think back to one of Ben's earlier slides where he talked about build to rent over here and wildcat development, I'll read off the definition that the department provided. The proliferation of development by splitting new residential parcels with the intent to circumvent laws relating to the creation of subdivision. And this is a situation where we have a proliferation of development where these lots don't have an assured water supply because they're circumventing the subdivision requirements that trigger assured water supply. So I think that's a good question, Rusty, and the answer is this committee has an opportunity to look at, are there areas where we can make policy improvements so that communities have assured water where appropriate? So, again, Ben Alternator tried to do a good job level setting at the beginning. I don't think this is an attempt to regulate all lot splitting into oblivion, but to find opportunities where there are challenges for the state and possibly the county on where there are opportunities for improvement to prevent this intentional circumvention of the subdivision requirements, which then trigger good water management.
And I'm grateful. Is there a chairperson?
I'm sitting in for the chair.
Okay.
So.
Madam Chairman, I'm grateful, that we're trying to do 2 or 3 things at once, but the main focus is the end result is what we've had to deal with personally with our company, but also, and to try to be helpful. But what we don't want to do is incentivize that activity onward, having to challenge after challenge after challenge, trying to save those problems. One thing we might want to do is look again at how much water an exempt well can use. Because 35 gallons a minute or less times 60 times 60 times 24 or whatever, actually it gets up to more water than even I can drink. And so that might be a help, but a small piece of the problem. But I personally live on a lot split. I think I was pretty legal 42 years ago when we did it. And I have a neighbor, but the only concert we went to was, I think, a Three Dog Night concert, which was pretty good then. So I understand if you're trying to avoid subdivision laws, in a sense, I think that this is a relation with the build to rent idea that we're trying to avoid subdivision laws because of that certificate. It comes down to water and cost and zoning, all of which could be adapted to make a product more usable, desirable, accessible for entry-level homes and the latter. And I think these two are related in that sense.
Thank you, Mr. Bowers. Representative Griffin.
Well, this is my issue. This is the part of the American dream in Cochise County. People move out as far as they can afford. They can afford a 4-acre parcel, a third interest in a well, 2.5 kids, a dog, and a double wide. And that's affordable housing in my area. The well capacity, if you don't have water, the disclosures that are out there, not only in statute that we updated this past year, maybe we need to increase that, but there is a seller's disclosure if you're a realtor and using realtor forms, realizing that everybody does not use realtor forms, but it's an example of what all is disclosed. And it is everything that is in the public report. We developed it 20-some years ago, and the same discussion about stopping lot splits were because there was no public report. So we created a public report with a seller's disclosure form and took all the items and continually, it spells out what the definition of subdivision is. It spells out whether the roads are publicly maintained, privately maintained, not maintained. It has disclosures in here. If the roads are not publicly maintained, it is the responsibility of the property owner to maintain the roads, and the roads that are not improved by the county standards and accepted by the county are not the county's responsibility. It has water issues, identifies Is there a well? Is it a private well? Is it public water? It identifies whether or not there's a super fund, quality insurance revolving fund with soil settlement, drainage problems, fissures. It has erosion control, wetlands, endangered species. I mean, you name it, it's in this Arizona Realtors disclosure form to include separate amendments, addendums for septic tanks, whether or not the property is suitable for a regular septic tank or needs, in certain areas in Cochise County, the water is shallow and a septic tank, regular septic doesn't go in, so you need an alternative above ground system. It identifies that information, and there's a separate one for your well relating to the 55 number and the department information and how many, how deep it is, how many gallons per minute it is pumped. And so along with land and property ownership comes responsibility. If you don't have water, if your well that you drill and there are dry wells that are drilled, then you have to figure out how to haul water. I'm very familiar with that. I lived in Ethiopia, and we had army trucks that filled up our water tanks out in the middle of nowhere. But this is a decision with full knowledge. If you have a piece of property you want to sell, and I want to buy it, and I know everything there is to know about it, government should not stop me from, and these wells, depending on where they're at, court decisions are going to determine whether or not you can drill or if there's water there. So, we could take some of these issues and put into statute, and we do have the affidavit of disclosure in statute. Doesn't cover all the items that are in the realtors one, but we can fix that. And if you don't want to live in an area that you have to have hauled water, don't buy it. Personal decision. I live in a lot split as well. I live in Ramsey Canyon, one of the most beautiful areas in the world. I bought 20 acres. I have 8 acres left because I couldn't afford the property taxes in a nice area. As the taxes go up, you can only hold on to it as long as you can, and then you got to sell a piece of it in order to afford what you have. So it's a property right that we need to protect. If there are bad players, by all means, if they're skirting the subdivision requirements, come up with a penalty. Bad players should be taken care of. That's, if you sell 6 or more, you are a subdivider. Maybe you need to put in the improvements.
Thank you,
Not just
Representative Griffin.
Thank
yeah,
you.
not just a slap on the wrist, but that's what I would suggest.
I think that you bring up a great point about bad players, right? And the intentional circumvention of our subdivision requirements. Jim, can you talk about what the penalties are for acting in concert or illegally subdividing?
Of course. And yeah, and I'll take the opportunity to say, I work with Spencer a lot on home builders, and I can say membership, most of members are well in compliance. They work very well with our department, title companies, to meet those, the subdivision public report requirements. As it relates to bad players, however, I can tell you earlier this year, we found a company that had about 100 properties in northern Arizona, sprawling 4 or 5 different counties. We worked to bring them into compliance for where those properties did create illegal subdivisions. Patrick, to your point, it is, as of this year, legislature increased the penalty to $2,000 per subdivision. So if we found an illegal subdivision of 6 to 50, $2,000 is the maximum penalty for that developer. It is not per property, it is per subdivision.
to that point, that's something we can address.
Thank you, Representative Griffin. And we had a number of people that wanted to speak. We'll go with Senator Sundaration and then Cynthia and then Warren. Senator.
Thank you. I guess immediately following on that, I think some of the questions and points I wanted to talk about were, to say thank you for laying out the challenges that Department of Real Estate has identified. I think that's really valuable information and can guide us to think about how to fix it. So for example, the acting in concert as well, perhaps returning to a time where we removed the intent piece so that you're able to more aggressively pursue that, as well as raising the penalty, because that's clearly not a significant amount given home prices. And, even the other points, although they aren't necessarily the definition that Ben raised as far as the illegal subdivision for wildcats, I do think that, I think it's taking a step back because, Representative Griffin, you were discussing the seller disclosure as a very useful tool. I also do think that, within an AMA, this is where we have the highest protection. We should have the highest protection for a water supply. And so to think that there are areas within an AMA where you can build a house or, purchase a house previously built and then find out that there is no water, as we heard so frequently this session, that's disconcerting. And I think we should be shooting for a very high level of protection in the AMA, and even perhaps to the point where we're relying on the AMA itself as a signal that your water supply is protected because you live within these aquifer boundaries. And so I am really appreciative of the other challenges identified here. I'm very interested in looking at the current threshold and determining whether 6 is really the appropriate, because that does allow areas where you've got houses of 5 or more, 5 or fewer, where there is no assured water supply required. Let's look at the timing issue. I think that's really interesting, and I do want to ask, and perhaps that's where we're going next, is to the city or other counterparts here on the committee. Is this an area where other levels of government should be empowered to start thinking ahead, and so not waiting for the Department of Real Estate report to determine whether a assured water supply is going to be required? Should that process occur earlier on in the zoning process? Yeah, and so finally, I mean, there's the four challenges outlined here. So thinking about perhaps a removal of that contiguous definition to be able to more broadly account for what is in effect a subdivision.
Thank you, Senator. Deputy, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, if I could, real quick, Senator, thank you for that. And just back to the penalty, obviously the department's not interested in increasing a penalty for the sake of the penalty. One piece of, Patrick, what I left off was the state will also record if a violation is found. The state will also record with the county recorder the violation, and it does entangle the properties, preventing them from being sold until compliance is found. So that is, I believe that the actual recordation is required. But what the county does in recording the violation against each property is voluntary by the county. They would not actually have to record it against the lots involved themselves. So if we're looking to policy changes that would improve that, it would be to mandate that it be recorded against the lots involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Director. I wanted to get to Cynthia next. She's been waiting patiently. Thank you, Cynthia.
I really, in some ways, have more of a rhetorical question. In a former life, I was a land use attorney, and so I'm somewhat familiar, well, actually more than somewhat, with the requirements and with what happens in development. And I do agree with Representative Griffin that our disclosure requirements are pretty extensive, and that's a good thing. I think the policy question that the state has to ask itself is whether or not it will stand by those seller disclosures as the end of the road for people who choose to do what they do, move into a house with no assured water supply, knowing that they don't have one, that they're relying upon hauled water. And as a state, if that is something that we're willing to say that is their God-given right to do, and they can do that, but at the same time, if that is the policy of the state, then the state needs to be prepared to let people who make that decision deal with the ramifications of those decisions and not force government or a private water company or any other water provider to assume responsibility or liability that they did not create or accept, to the detriment of all the people who are customers of that water provider or that private water company, or, you know, because I saw that happen many, many times when I was at ADEQ in rural areas where people simply did not have a water supply. But the question is going to become, is the state okay with that? If the state's okay with that, I think we're okay with that. But we are not okay with the idea that if someone, despite the extensive disclosure requirements, makes a conscious decision to do that, is then going to be rescued by that same government that gave them that God-given right from their own, I'm not going to use the word I want to use, but their own decision to do that. And so that's where we have the problem. Or is it bothersome enough to the state from the public perception, the national perception that was tied to the most recent event, which is unfortunate, and also the burden on existing water providers who are compelled to take customers that they did not sign up for. So that's my only question. We need to have it one way, or we need to have it the other.
Thank you, Cynthia. Warren?
I was just wanted to add that my concern on this issue is that this issue, if we're going to deal with it, I'm only looking at it from within the AMAs, because I'm looking at when we have a situation in which homes are not able to have the water that they need, that then has a ripple effect throughout the AMA, and particularly where you're in the Phoenix AMA, which is where you have so many water providers, communities that have stepped up and have made investments and have done all that they can to provide water, have a 100-year assured water supply, demonstrate that and have that designation, as well as other parts of the AMA that have worked with to have certificates to demonstrate an assured water supply, that the national ramification or the national news that we got this spring over Rio Verde foothills was negative and difficult for us as a state, not on that community so much as questions about Scottsdale. Do you have water? Phoenix was getting questions. Others in this area was getting questions. And so as a state, I believe that if in the AMA, the assured water supply is required, or it's something that the communities have to meet, that we have to demonstrate an assured water supply, then we need to make sure that any gaps have been closed so that we can avoid any perpetuation of, or avoid having the same circumstance that happened this spring from ever happening again, because that is negative on the economy and what we're trying to have a strong water management that we've built on. That just starts eroding away that in the public perception.
Thank you, Warren. I appreciate it. Yes, Joe.
Thanks, Carol. I had a question on some of the original work that staff kind of compiled on this issue. One of the bullets on this topic under ADWR's initial concept on, I guess, how to start addressing this cites strengthening the act in concert provisions. Did staff and I don't want to put Jim on the spot, but it sounds like he spent a whole lot more time than he maybe wanted to even thinking about this one already. Have any ideas on what we could do that would strengthen that if that's actually part of a solution to this?
I don't know if that we've gone that far with it so far internally. We wanted today to start educating ourselves on this issue more thoroughly, and start to have some initial discussion, get some input from all of you. We intend to come back to this topic and continue to discuss it in more depth, hopefully get some ideas from you. We'll be working internally as staff to consider some ideas. We'll certainly be working with DRE to see what ideas they may have as well. But I think the fact that we've laid out the challenges here today is really, for me, it's a very helpful starting point in terms of focusing our attention. Ben, would you add anything to that? You've spent a little bit more time digging into these issues.
Yeah, I don't think we have anything baked ready to share with the committee, but I would be interested, like Carol mentioned, these challenges kind of push themselves towards creating some solutions here. And so I think hearing from the committee today and I know that we haven't all had time to digest everything here, but if there are some maybe knee-jerk things to have us look back and study a little more to bring back as a concept, we'd love to hear those.
Certainly either today or in follow-up to the meeting, please don't hesitate to reach out to staff. But while we have the Deputy Commissioner here with us, are there any further questions? Anything that we could better understand that would help us dig into this? Yes, Representative Griffin.
I don't know whether it pertains to Jim or not, department or not, but back in 2007, there was legislation that passed referencing adequate water policy. Only 2 of the 15 counties adopted that, and that was Yuma and Cochise County, and that adequate water supply or policy overlays cities and towns. And so a question that I have is, why didn't the other 12 or 13 counties identify and pass a water adequate waters policy?
She can answer.
So I can't really speak for any particular county. I do know that after that legislation passed, ADWR did undertake a rulemaking process to consider modifying the physical availability rules for Northern Arizona and the Sea Aquifer in order to address the more unique, I guess, the unique hydrology in Northern Arizona. And I know that Coconino County in particular was closely following that rulemaking process. And then that ended up being, we were fairly close to the finish line. And then we had the first executive order for a rulemaking moratorium right before we got to post our notice of final, or I think before we got to submit to Governor's Regulatory Review Council. So we were fairly late in the process, but I don't know whether Coconino County would have adopted the mandatory adequacy requirements if we had moved forward with that rulemaking. It's possible they would, it's possible they would not have. But again, that legislation was designed, I think, to allow counties to make that choice based on their local needs. I think that was the whole point of the legislation, and it makes sense that some counties, cities, and towns might adopt it and some would not.
And to that point, Cochise County, all 3 of the supervisors came back and said, oops, we made a mistake by adopting it. Can we get out of it? And of course, could not do that. But you know, there's something in place right now that the counties can do by adopting that policy.
Okay, thank you, Representative Griffin. Okay, Senator Sundaration, yes. And then we'll wrap up on this topic, I think.
Okay, thank you. Since you asked while we have the Deputy Commissioner here, was wondering do you have a sense of how many cases you might have been able to pursue were the intent requirement not there or the contiguous, definition not, preventing that kind of action?
Yeah, Chair, Senator, are you asking in Rio Verde specifically or no? I would have no way to estimate how many illegal lot splits may be out there. We work closely with the counties to investigate those whenever they do get notice of the subdivision being divided, and they provide that to us at usually late in the game again, and then we begin our investigation. I want to say we investigate probably one instance of a subdivision in Maricopa County each month, probably. As it relates to Rio Verde, I can say the property disclosure that you are referencing, over the last 2 years, we subpoenaed over the last 2 years of transactions in Rio Verde, and every property owner was disclosed, whether it was hauled water or private water. So just to answer that question while I am here, but unfortunately, I can't tell you how many illegal subdivisions do exist or will find.
I'm one of those people.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner, for being with us today, for taking these questions, for preparing such a clear presentation to present the challenges to us. I'm sure we'll be talking in the future. Appreciate it. All right, and as I said, this was our initial conversation about this. To learn more about it, we'll be coming back to this topic. Definitely looking to have more input from all of you. If you have any questions or any comments in follow up to today's meeting on this topic, please let us know. Trent is always happy to take your emails and forward them to the appropriate people. At this time, I would like to invite Natalie Mast, ADWR's Active Management Areas Director, to present. She is going to describe grandfathered rights and the director's authority and the process for retiring those rights. And she'll provide a breakdown of the quantities and volumes of these rights and take any questions we might have as we learn about this topic. Natalie, thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, members of the council. My name is Natalie Mast. I am the Active Management Area Director at ADWR. And what I'll cover today is some of the existing statutory authority and some of the data that we have available related to grandfathered rights. Next slide, please. There are 3 types of grandfathered rights in AMAs. So the one that people think of most often is irrigation grandfathered rights, which allows the owner or the holder to irrigate acres that were historically irrigated for that AMA. As we've seen with the Douglas AMA, that historic time period can be a little bit different. For the initial AMAs, it was 1975 through 1979. For Douglas, it was 2022 back to 2017. Making sure I'm doing my math right in my head. All right. Irrigation grandfathered rights are tied to the land. They can only be used for irrigation. So that's an important distinction here. Irrigation grandfathered rights cannot be used to withdraw water in an AMA for non-irrigation uses. The next item on this list is Type 1 non-irrigation grandfathered rights. Type 1s are created from a permanent retirement of an irrigation grandfathered right. This is a non-irrigation type of right. And there is some nuance associated with Type 1s related to where that water can be used either on or off of the land. Those are limited to a maximum of 3 acre-feet per acre. Type 2s are also done irrigation grandfathered rights. These are our most flexible types of grandfathered rights. So these are, again, for non-irrigation uses, cannot be used for irrigation purposes, but they're based on historic non-irrigation uses. And part of the reason these are flexible is that they can actually be used anywhere in the active management area. They're not tied to the land. And if the owner, for example, is not using the full volume, they can lease a portion of that volume to another entity in another location within the AMA. Next slide, please. So our authority associated with purchase and retirement of grandfathered rights is contained in the management plans statutes. And the entirety of the language in the statute is on the screen. So the framework there is not very extensive, but what this does include is an allowance that we could purchase and retire grandfathered rights. It doesn't specify irrigation grandfathered rights, so this could include any type of grandfathered rights, any type of those 3 rights that I listed out on the last slide. This language was first included under the statutes for the 3rd management plans and was included in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th management plan statutes for the AMAs. The other thing that I'll have you note while this language is on the screen is that it references the purchase and retirement of grandfathered rights. It doesn't reference anything about the purchase and retirement of the land. So in developing a theoretical program for this, ADWR would be looking to purchase the retirement of the right rather than looking to own and manage any land. Next slide here. Thank you. So what you can see on the screen now is really just kind of a range of options for a theoretical program. For implementation, we would have to do a modification to the 5th management plans in order to create and adopt a program like this. Potential provisions, like I said, we would look at purchasing the retirement of the right, not the associated land. So whoever the existing owner was might retain ownership of that land. And a potential program could include any single type of grandfathered rights, or it could contain some combination of those 3 grandfathered rights, some or all of them. There is a statutory provision allowing a portion of withdrawal fees to be dedicated to the purchase and retirement of grandfathered rights. It's a specific line item. It's not something that the department has put into place previously, but there is an allowance for a portion of those withdrawal fees to go toward purchase and retirement of grandfathered rights. Something I'll note, though, is that that provision related to withdrawal fees does not prohibit other sources from being used to fund that activity. Next slide, please. So what I'll go through now is really just a little bit of information about those 3 right types. What you'll notice on these slides is that, so the 3 columns here are the allotment, so the total allowable pumping associated with those rights, the amount of pumping associated with those rights in 2021, and then just a percentage kind of comparing those 2 numbers. So what you can notice here is that our utilization of type 1s, and you'll see this some differences here across the slides, our utilization of type 1s is not very high. There is some variation across AMAs, obviously higher in Prescott, lower in Santa Cruz, lower in Tucson. But the total utilization of type 1s in the active management areas is, I think the average was around 30%. Next slide, please. Type 2s are a similar story. And type 2s, there's the additional nuance here that remaining volume on any type 2s could theoretically be leased. Again, a little bit of variation across AMAs, but again, kind of in that 30% range of utilization on type 2s. Next slide. Irrigation grandfathered rights are a little bit more of a complex picture. Something I want to point out that's important is the asterisk at the bottom of this slide, which indicates that these values only include those IGFRs that are currently, that is stated wrong, sorry, that are currently not regulated under the BMP program. I apologize, we'll make sure to fix that typo. The reason for that is that unfortunately, the way our database is set up, I'm not able to query the allotments for grandfathered rights that are currently in the BMP program. So we could eventually get at those numbers, but we weren't able to assemble that information for this meeting. But what you can see is that, again, by AMA, there is a little bit of variation in the specific utilization of grandfathered rights, at least those that are in the allotment style, the base program. Next slide, please. Just one last thing that I'll note associated with the irrigation grandfathered rights is that some of these percentages maybe don't tell the whole story. There's a lot of variation by location, particularly for the irrigation grandfathered rights. You'll see pretty broad variability by location, by irrigation district, that type of thing in terms of the percent utilization for irrigation grandfathered rights. And I think that's my last slide. So with that, I will pass it back to Carol, and I'd gladly take any questions.
Thank you, Natalie, for unpacking that for us. Obviously, we still have some details to sort out about how this would work in practice, but clearly we have a mechanism already in place for this. That's what we wanted to make sure all of you understood today as a starting point. Warren, you have a question or a comment? Yes.
Thank you, Natalie, for this presentation. I might be doing something wrong with the numbers in my head, but here we're pointing out Salt River project for an allotment of 77,000, but it was the slide before showed the Phoenix AMA of allotment of 354,000 with 277,000. So you were just showing SRP that was just.
Yeah, and so what that first slide or that last slide showed was just kind of an example of some of the larger districts in each AMA. SRP happened to be the largest district within the Phoenix AMA.
Yes, Cynthia.
I have a quick question. With regard to type 1 and type 2 rights, which you pointed out about 34% of them have been used. When the modeling was done for the Phoenix groundwater model, was it modeled as if all of those rights were being fully utilized through the 100 years or not?
And I'm going to look at Ryan to confirm for me, but my understanding is that modeling was based on current use, not on potential use.
Yeah, I believe the model, did it use 2021 use? So the same numbers that are shown in the 2021 use column are the numbers that were assumed for the 100-year projection for the Phoenix AMA model.
So, and there's nothing within anything that's happened since the model was issued that would prevent the other 60-some% of those rights being further utilized, is there?
There could theoretically be additional pumping associated with those rights, yes.
So in some ways, they're kind of like a ticking time bomb out there in terms of out there to be used and could be utilized, further utilized.
That's possible. I suspect that the nature of those rights, the reason why they aren't being fully utilized has to do more with the nature of those rights. A type 2, to my knowledge, a lot of the type 2 use is used to establish a service area right. So then once you've used it that first year and you've established your service area right, you're going to pump pursuant to your service area right and let go of your lease on your type 2. For a type 1 right, those are to some extent appurtenant to the land with some exceptions. Pretty much everything about a type 1 has an exception, a rule and an exception. But I think that the unique constraints on the type 1 mean that at some point people will stop utilizing them just because the uses have changed and maybe they no longer fit the constraints of the type 1 right. And again, those two types of use are non-irrigation uses that may be more easily served by a service area right. So to some extent, I think particularly the type 1s are less likely to be a ticking time bomb. I think once they go out of use, they get replaced with either another water supply or a different water use. I think the type 2s maybe, but again, even if you have a type 2, I'm just not sure. I'm not sure that those have served to be useful. I think they were useful when they were established. Obviously, people were using them at the time, but I think there are other rights that better suit the needs.
I will clarify one piece there, that we do still see pretty substantial utilization of type 2s for non-irrigation types of uses, whether it be a turf facility or other industrial type of facility. Those are used more broadly than things like service area establishments.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. Yes, Patrick.
I appreciate Cynthia's question, particularly clarifying that the model included was based on use. So when we talk, and maybe I'm just restating for my own understanding, if we talk about potentially retiring these rights, if we're retiring unused rights, it may address the ticking time bomb issue that Cynthia just pointed out. But if we really want to make a change in terms of overall groundwater use to have a benefit to the aquifer, those retirements would need to be focused on existing uses. That's correct?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, Spencer.
I'm just, if I understood correctly, you have the authority to do this now, and I was just curious, and if I have that wrong, just let me know, but I was just curious as to why you haven't exercised the authority to do this already, number one. And then number two is, if you do, we do this program, however it is developed, is there a change to tax status on property? Is that one of the challenges here?
Sure. So the first kind of available timeframe for this to have been implemented, the first statutory authority for it was with the third management plans. From what I've seen in our historical documentation, my understanding there is that in the past, different folks looked at this over time and determined for various reasons over time that it wasn't worth implementing either for the third management plan or the fourth management plans. We didn't really go into detail on in the fifth management plans process on whether to implement this. It's a may provision. We can choose to if it seems feasible. And with the accelerated schedule of the fifth management plans, we didn't really dive into detail on this particular item.
Yeah, I would say that it has become more of a question for us recently. We've heard from stakeholders that this might be something worth considering, which is one of the reasons it's in front of you today. Yes, Senator.
Thank you. And actually, I know that there was another proposal listed that we said we didn't have time for yet, but I think this ties in, which is the idea of trying to incentivize development on agricultural lands, and some of that could be done through either private sector retirement or public sector retirement of some of these rights. And I appreciate the conversation so far to clarify, the relative priority of retirement of some of these rights, because, in some ways they all represent unreplenished pumping, but the utilization rates are interesting because it shows there's opportunity right now to head off some of the potential growth and to think about a program going forward that could also shift use away from grandfathered rights use so that we can address the shortfalls. So I really just appreciate the data provided. I think I'm not sure, and maybe there's a little more diving into the data that might be helpful for us to figure out how to support you in setting up a program. But I think that's the authorities there, I think that's great. If there's funding available to put towards it, I think that would be a good concept, a good pilot to start to show the potential here to be able to address those shortfalls.
Yes, Joe.
Hi, I'll play the historical documents for a minute. We did look at it for the third management plan development, and at least based off just trying to use the provision for the extra withdrawal fees, when we looked at it in Pinal, there just wasn't near enough money in it to make a meaningful difference. We were looking at having to purchase the land and not somehow just purchasing the right. Although if you just purchase the right off a piece of ag land, you've completely changed the allowable use of the land, and I think that's probably going to be difficult unless you were to run into some magic circumstance where it worked with a particular landowner. It might be worth rerunning the math if you're thinking about it funds in addition to that, but I can tell you in about 26 years worth of Pinal GUACs, I haven't run into many of them that had an appetite to increase the total withdrawal fees beyond the $3 that they've been at for years.
Okay, any other questions about this topic? Any other thoughts initially? Yes, Mr. Bowers.
Just generally, if you were to measure the importance of the issue and its impact on the goal, where is this issue?
Natalie, any thoughts on that?
I don't know that I'd be able to answer that off the top of my head. I think I'd have to look more closely at our previous analyses of the management goals to be able to answer that more clearly.
The point only is if the result of the activity of what we're entertaining, there's the pros and cons that you're going to have to deal with, people pro and con. And then what's the end result? Is it as big as perhaps some of the other two issues that we talked about today? And in its importance to the governor's view looking forward? So we could get some assessment of how much we need to fire up the drivers.
We would be able to look at that. I just don't have that prepared for today.
Thank you.
And I would say that, it presents an opportunity.
Right.
And it presents a voluntary opportunity as well, which we always looking to see where we can find those. So certainly worth a consideration, and we can do some more exploration. Patrick, do you have any comments in terms of the governor's position on this?
Sure, I would just say this is in response to several requests from committee members to look into this, and I appreciate the department pulling this information together. It's really interesting. I think we have an opportunity to retire unreplenished pumping, the old holes in the bucket, right?
Yeah.
But also we have to see if, the juice is worth the squeeze. What is the impact of retiring rights that aren't currently in use today, but also you're permanently taking that off the book so that you don't see a ramp up in those demands. So from my perspective, we're looking for that sort of feedback from this committee, and folks can chew on this. And if there's more information you need, we can have the department look into that to see where does this fall within our suite of options to recommend.
Warren, I saw you had your hand up.
I was just thinking, I think Patrick probably said it well, of what I was thinking is that having these grandfathered rights out there means that at some point they will be used, and that adds to unreplenished groundwater pumping that occurs in the AMA. And thinking of this just here in the Phoenix AMA, as well as it would happen in other AMAs. But so the other thought that I was wondering is there a way to maybe have, if someone is utilizing this, or the idea that comes to my mind, and I'll just throw it out there and put it on Ken, is if and I'm not all sure of how the Commerce Authority all works and functions, but but if there's a incentive to bring in certain industries and you're encouraging and putting an incentive on for utilizing an irrigation grandfather right, well, maybe that shouldn't be incentivized as much as if you're bringing in and utilizing an industry within a designated provider or that is able to fit within the assured water supply demonstration. So that's just maybe another way of looking at how to discourage the use of these without regulating it.
Thank you, Warren. Any other questions on this topic? Any other thoughts? All right, I think we've covered this for today. Natalie, thank you for the time. I appreciate you putting this information together on relatively short order, and look forward to bringing you back to discuss this in more depth again in a future meeting. So with that, let's talk about the next steps. You should have received an email from Trent, but as a reminder, the next full council meeting, we had to push that out 1 week later to Wednesday, September 6th at 1 o'clock. We apologize for the inconvenience, but the director had one of those unavoidable conflicts, and we do want him to be present as the chair. So thank you for your understanding. At this time, we have not set another subcommittee meeting. We'll be looking into what additional information we need to dig up as staff and where the subcommittee members are in their development of their concepts. The next Assured Water Supply Committee meeting is tentatively scheduled for Tuesday, September 12th at 1 p.m. And that brings us to a close. I thank you all for your participation today. Patrick, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share?
Thank you, Carol. I just want to thank the committee members for attending today, and just know we saw several items today that address high-profile, important loopholes in our water management framework, several items that strengthen the Assured Water Supply Program. And so those are important parts of this process, and we need to continue to move forward on those issues. And so, the department will be working with the committee to schedule further subcommittee working group meetings, make sure we have the right people at the table, the subject matter experts. Like we saw today, it was very helpful to have the Deputy Real Estate Commissioner here in the room today. So we'll continue to make progress on those.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. There's a little bit of a delay between the mics, I noticed. And I want to point out, Trent just brought to my attention, we need to double check the time of the council meeting on September 6th, just to make sure that it's correct. I'm sorry, that it was the Assured Water Supply Committee meeting on Tuesday, September 12th. We're going to check the time on that one. So we will send out confirmations to all of you, and we'll make sure we have it on the website at the correct times. Still tentative, as things could shift a little bit, but we will keep you updated on future meetings. With that, Jen, we're informed that it's going to be at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, September 12th. Thank you. All right, I really appreciate everybody's participation today. I think the discussion was robust and very helpful for us as staff. So we'll continue to move things forward. Have a great rest of the day. Oh, wait, Representative Griffin, did you have something you wanted to say?
Thank you. I think last year's, under former Governor Ducey's, there was a question as to information on individual wells, and I don't know if that's been resolved. Do you have, all we see is those dots on the map. Do you have the type of well they are? Are they residential? Are they commercial? Are they industrial? And information on those. I know the department was working on it. And the question was, at least there were applications for wells. The information whether or not there was ever a pump in them, whether they were retired or anything. Has that been resolved? If not, can we talk about that issue? Because that's important information. If there are wells that are retired and they're still showing, I think we need to further look at that information.
Okay, I think we'll have to look into that and
Okay.
follow up and see where that is.
Yeah, so wells, so when a well is drilled, a person first has to get a permit to drill the well, and then they are required to submit a drill log and then a pump installation report. What they're required to do and what actually happens might have a little bit of a gap between it, but we can definitely follow up and provide a little more information on all of that. And
That'd be very helpful, because I understand, maybe they didn't finish the well, but if they're still counted as a well, I think that would be important information. And we asked, is unmet demand going to be addressed in a future meeting? Further discussion on that or not?
Yes, we understand. I think you're talking about the modeling. You have some questions about that, and we realized that there were a number of questions that some of the council members had on that topic. We will bring that back at a future meeting. We're just building on the momentum that we had from these most recent meetings and getting some of these concepts under discussion. But that's certainly a topic we do intend to come back to. Thank you for reminding everyone of that. So, okay, I think we've got it. All right, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you again.